can hear the gardeners.
Oh,
Hey, welcome everybody to episode 37 of Sports Shorts. I'm your host, Bobby Hacker, and my guest today is Andrew Ascher. Andrew is, I'm happy to say, the winner of the Sports Lawyers Association 10th Annual Student Writing Award. Student Writing Award, I just got a message, everybody, that's why I paused, of our Student Writing Award. And he won first prize this year on a paper entitled Gimme Standing, How the PGA Tour Gave Its Members Antitrust Standing. We'll get to that in a minute, but welcome, Andrew.
thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. Very excited.
So why don't you let some folks know, as we normally do with our guests, tell them what you're doing now, your law school experience, how you came to the SLA.
Sure. Yeah. So I just graduated from the University of Iowa College of Law up in Iowa City. How I kind of found myself with the Sports Lawyers Association and kind of writing for this competition. I had a really good friend of mine in law school. We would sit and argue about baseball over lunch every day our first year of law school. And then the university offered a class on baseball salary arbitration during our second year. And we said we might as well get a credit for doing this if we're going to sit and talk about baseball. We might as well, have some fun with it and get some school credit. And that's where I met Dan Matheson, who's the sports law professor at the University of Iowa. And he kind of was a strong motivating factor in my interest in sports law and kind of pushing me towards, attending some of the Sports Lawyers Association's, online events and following all of that. And then, of course, continuously reminding all of us that the writing competition was available to us as an opportunity to, explore something that we found really interesting and in the legal sports world. And so, of course, was able to take advantage of that this past year. But like I said, just graduated. So currently studying for the bar. I'm in Kansas City at the moment, planning on taking the Missouri bar in July and then starting up work with a firm here in town in Kansas City pretty quick after that. So that's what I've got.
It sounds like the right path, and happy that you had Professor Matheson to be so supportive of the SLA and to get you interested. Sorry that you had to go through your first 2 years of law school with a virtual SLA, but I was happy that you're able to experience some live stuff in Atlanta this year. So thank you for being involved with the organization. So you wrote one of the more prescient papers we've had in a while. Really before this LIV or live or 54 golf, whatever we're going to call it, that Greg Norman has put together with the Saudis. But you raised the real interesting because it was percolating. This would be a real thing. And you took to using in your paper, which I'd like you to talk a little bit about, but basically you looked at what might happen in this new world with this new competition challenging the PGA in light of, I guess it was a 1990 case in the senior tour. So you want to walk us through it a little bit in terms of, and folks, we're going to be talking antitrust, and it's really interesting. Don't be frightened by the words antitrust.
Yes, as is kind of the new phase of ununionized sports, using antitrust to kind of move forward some labor rights in theory, at least. So so the paper, I kind of think chronological order is the best way to think about some of these issues. So it kind of starts in the early 90s with the FTC potentially thinking about bringing charges against the PGA Tour regarding two of its rules that would regulate the play of its members. So those two rules being regarding media rights and then conflicting events. So the two rules essentially give the PGA Tour kind of a green light, red light, effectively to kind of give a thumbs up or thumbs down when its members want to play golf somewhere else for money, right? So essentially, anytime a player wanted to go play some other tournament that wasn't PGA Tour sponsored, they needed permission from the tour to be able to do that. So if you think about recently, the match, right? Capital One's the match that was put on with Tiger Woods and Phil Mickelson, and all of this is kind of the method you would go through as a player would be to file, permission with the tour to be able to play an event like that. And so the FTC, of course, never did bring charges. There's kind of a little bit of writing on this out of, I think, the LA Times, kind of saying Tim Fincham goes to DC and then we never hear about it ever again in the media. But of course, as you mentioned, there was a senior tour member. His name was Harry Toscano, who pretty quickly after all of this happened did file an antitrust lawsuit against the PGA Tour. And of course, what Mr. Toscano suffered from that the FTC would not have if it had filed suit is that Toscano has to prove standing, that he is the correct plaintiff to be bringing the suit. And so Toscano fails in his original suit in the mid to late 90s, basically because his claims are too speculative. He claims that these two rules that require permission from the tour to go play anywhere else essentially block out the market and say, he essentially claims, there would be other senior tours that would offer me money to play if these rules didn't exist. And the court, dismisses in a pretty preliminary motion on standing that essentially the claims are too speculative. And so, like you said, this kind of percolates and that kind of thing. So this sits dormant for decades, really, the idea of antitrust enforcement against the PGA Tour. But my paper, I think, kind of argues that all changes when, as you mentioned, Saudi Arabian government through the Public Investment Fund kind of gets involved in the game of golf in 2019, hosting an annual tournament, the Saudi Invitational. And the main thing that makes it different than the PGA Tour in a significant way is that it offered appearance fees to players. So players on the PGA Tour it's a meritocracy in its purest form. So you show up to a tournament. If you miss the cut, you make no money. And then any money you do make after you make the cut is based purely on how you performed relative to your peers, right? So first place gets the most money, second place gets the next most money. And that's kind of all, on the way down. But Saudi International kind of proposed something different to guys on the tour and said, the most popular players, right? Dustin Johnson, these names you hear now, Phil Mickelson, will offer you, X amount of dollars to just come and play. And anything you make on top of that is gravy. But, players, a lot of them saw that as a fantastic opportunity to supplement what they were doing. And so in 2019 and 2020, this event was actually held as a part of the European Tour, which is now the DP World Tour. So there wasn't really much of an issue. The PGA Tour and the DP World Tour have had a great relationship going back quite some time. So players were able to get waivers pretty easily. But this previous year in 2022, the DP World Tour kind of removes the Saudi International from its calendar, theoretically, because of all of this percolating, right? The idea that the Saudis, through the Public Investment Fund and Greg Norman now as the face of the league that actually was speculative when I was writing the paper, but has obviously come to fruition in the time since, was going to be a competitor to the PGA Tour and the European Tour, so it ends up off the schedule. And what seems kind of silly now, because we have all these players, moving and playing on the LIV Tour, but at the time, these players had filed for an exemption to go play in the Saudi International in 2022. And the PGA Tour granted it conditionally, essentially said, you can go play this year, but over the next 2 or 3 years, we want you to play in the PGA Tour event that takes place that same weekend. So essentially saying, if you go play this week, you can't play in 1 or 2 of the next 3 or 4 that'll theoretically be, operating the same weekend as, I think it was the AT&T on the PGA Tour.
It's the same weekend as the AT&T Pro-Am.
Right. And so what the paper kind of acknowledges and argues essentially is that the speculative harm that Harry Toscano was talking about in the 90s, saying, oh, there might be a tour, there would be a tour if the rules didn't exist. And, we don't know who it would be or what it would look like, but there would be one. All of a sudden that has disappeared. So The paper kind of walks through it's a 5-factor analysis of antitrust standing, 2 of which Toscano actually won in the original case, the nature of the harm alleged, and then the risk of duplicative recovery. These were 2 things Toscano had already won, and those, still kind of the analysis is the same. But the paper kind of goes through those things that Toscano lost, the directness of the injury, and here the players are kind of clearly banned from playing in the Saudi International over a certain amount of years. And then the speculative measure of the harm is kind of cured by this appearance fee, right? So if there's no worry of not making money if the Saudis are saying, we'll give you X amount of dollars. There's no longer speculation as to how much. You don't have to prove that you would win, or that you'd win, any certain amount of money, or you'd make the cut, or anything like that. There's a pretty hard dollar amount there. And then, the complexity and apportioning damages, I think, is the last factor, and a similar story there of, this new kind of way of paying golfers solves that issue.
Yeah, so it's interesting now because in the sports world, I don't know if you saw it today, but the PGA and the DP Tour are now wrapping their arms around each other in a great embrace, which seems to me a clear case of not having spoken with your antitrust lawyer before you come publicly about how you're creating more strength, what appears to be to challenge the Live Tour, we'll call it. Because again, I don't know if it's called LIV 54 or what, but
no,
we'll
I
just
think,
call it the Live Tour for discussion.
I think Live is
today.
right. Yeah. But yeah, no, that's certainly, that's kind of one thing when I started thinking about this, was, what is the paper going to look like? And that was kind of luckily part of it that I was able to avoid is what exactly is the claim, right? So Toscano's claim involved collusion between the tour and broadcast media, and essentially saying, the tour's promising, Fox or CBS or whoever that they'll have the best golf event that weekend, right? They can't promise that any one individual player will be there, but they promise that the best players in the world, because they play on the PGA Tour, and we control whether they play somewhere else, they're not going to be playing in some other event, and there's not going to be some other event operating that weekend that's better. They can. That's the product to the TV, to CBS or to ESPN or whoever it might be, is that there's not going to be a better golf tournament on this weekend. It's us.
But let me ask you a question, because one of the key elements of the antitrust claim is going to be, I think it's evident, an agreement. So you've got an agreement not to allow players that are on one tour participate in the PGA. We can't play in those events. But ultimately, when we work through all of the tests, you have to prove damages, right? So what do you think about a situation where either I've gotten a multi-million-dollar advance, and we've seen reported what all these numbers are. I have a guarantee for playing in the tournament that, at least in the first tournament, was about what someone would made in 5th place in a tournament, something like that. And if you win the first prize, I think starts at maybe 4 million, which is almost 2x what you make for winning the freaking Masters.
Yeah.
So the damage claim then becomes very speculative. It's only, if I play in these 8 live events, I could make money on the other, 12, let's say, PG events that don't conflict. Do you think that becomes an issue for the court, or if it ever gets to a court and trying to determine where you've been damaged?
Yeah, certainly. And I think, what you said kind of brings up in my mind is also just, when does a plaintiff decide to sue, right? That this is the best avenue for fixing this issue. And I don't think we've reached that point yet. I think the paper kind of speculates the idea of a player leaving to play in a single event and then wanting to come back to the PGA Tour. And so that would require a player filing for a release, being denied that release, and then going and playing in the event anyways, and then receiving some kind of suspension from the PGA Tour. So at that point, the damages would maybe even become, the right to play in the PGA Tour event that they've theoretically qualified for. and it's not necessarily monetary, but it'd become injunctive in that case. But what we saw leading up to the event, the Live event in London a few weeks ago, was a handful of players. Actually, I think it was most of them. Rather than they filed for the release, it was denied, and then rather than going over and violating the denial of release, they resigned their tour cards and said, I'm actually no longer subject to the rules at all because I've resigned my card. And so I don't know if I've thought through that all the way and what exactly does that implication has for players, because I think what the theory is, essentially from the player side who are resigning cards, is if I resign the card, I've no longer violated the rule by going and playing in a live event. And so if the whole thing falls apart at some point, I can unresign my card. And I think, the player handbook, from what I had seen online, and I wasn't able to double check it, but I think you can end up back in if you wait, there's like a waiting period for like a year or something like that. So that was kind of the theory, I think, for some of these guys, was instead of actually ever violating the rule, was to resign your card and say, kind of a you can't fire me, I quit situation.
Yeah. But when you look at it, I think the minimum payout in that first tournament was $375,000. So if I just show up for 8 tournaments a year, I'm making, more than $2.5 million. That's pretty high on the money winner list in the PGA.
No, it certainly is. Yeah. I mean,
And
I think, go ahead.
You look at the top earners and how many guys actually qualify. And if you don't qualify, you get nothing. You've just put money out. This live tournament, you just show up and you're guaranteed $375,000. And if you've been paid some of this upfront money, I mean, not everybody's getting the $100 million that Phil reportedly got, which I'm sure is to handle his gambling debts. Sorry, that was very. Yeah. But even people like I read, I think Ian Poulter got 10 million, but still, he's had a long career. 10 million is an appearance fee, and then you're guaranteed another 2.5 million if you play the 8 tournaments. It's kind of interesting. And for the guys that resign their card, what are they going to do? When they decide I don't want to be part of this anymore, I really want to go back to the PGA where there's actually, there's competition and a different kind of pressure. There's old school people. This is one of them who sees the traditional golf competition is different because you're all starting on the first hole. People are ahead of you. People are behind you. You just have to play your best game in order to make it to the weekend where you can actually get paid. And then there, it's a whole different competition. This, with the shotgun start, it's a great for TV. Great, you got a window. You can do this whole show in like 4 hours and show all the golf all the time, which quite frankly is a little frenetic, a little difficult, but it's, it seems to work, but it's hard to say because it's not rated, because it's not on a broadcast platform.
Mm-hmm.
So determining the number of streams, et cetera, and how successful it is remains to be seen. We have a comment here. It says he thinks one of the players did not resign, probably had a good injunctive claim. His damage would be stronger if he had a good track record of tour earnings. Yeah, same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And on DJ, was DJ going to win money across 12 PG events? Not lately. I mean, there was a time, sure.
I think he made the cut in the U.S. Open like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, but he hasn't been making all the cuts.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, I wonder even if there's even a claim of saying, I don't even have to make money. The damage is that I wasn't allowed to enter. Like I had, through the qualifying rules, like through the PGA Tour's own qualifying rules, had qualified to participate, and now I'm not allowed to because I'm suspended.
Right. Well, you're suspended because you violated what the media rights and the conflicting events rules under the PGA. Now, these are rules of the PGA, but again, we're in a situation where there's no union. So
Yes, and that's what I thought
that adds
was
a big wrinkle.
yes, and that's kind of the most interesting part of what I thought, when I was talking to friends about it, and it was like, isn't the PGA Tour a member-run organization and these kinds of things? And I think it's true in a sense, but also most of the decisions are made by the policy board. And that policy board, to my understanding, is made up of, four guys who are on the tour and then five, interested, essentially business people who get together. So I don't believe the players have a majority. If all the players got together and decided to get rid of these rules, I don't think that would be enough. It could be enough practically, but I don't think it could be enough technically in the sense that the players couldn't do it on their own. They would need help, and I think that's my understanding of it at least.
We have a great question here, which I'd like you to deal with. If the networks decline to enter into deals with Live, could that give rise to a cause of action?
Yeah, I certainly think this is the textbook. I think if you're a plaintiff, this is what you want to see theoretically to bring this claim would be some kind of overt agreement between the PGA Tour and its networks to not broadcast, or not even its networks, but competing networks to not broadcast the Live events. That's kind of, I think, textbook anti-competitive behavior. And even in the Toscano case, the court acknowledged that this is the kind of injury, the kind of, antitrust harm that was anticipated by, the Sherman Antitrust Act. And so I think that's the kind of thing that a plaintiff would be looking for. But at the moment, there's not really any, there's no evidence that that's the kind of thing that's occurring.
Well,
So
exactly. And it seems to me as a old TV guy here, the networks want to get properties and they can freely bargain for them and put them on the air. And it's one thing if the networks that broadcast PGA events just say, you know what, we could do this, but it might piss off the PGA and they're a great partner. We don't want to do it. There's not an antitrust claim there.
right.
If all the networks said, if you show LIV, we will not renew our rights with you. Clear antitrust violation, correct?
Right. Yeah, I think, the each individual, broadcaster could come to its own decision and even say, we don't think this is a viable product. We don't want to put it on air. That's one thing. But if at the direction or the encouragement of the PGA Tour, the networks are making decisions regarding Live, to Live's disfavor, I think that's where an antitrust claim comes up. And then at that point, the plaintiff there is probably actually Live Golf itself as a corporate entity, as opposed to individual PGA Tour members potentially. But yeah, I'm sorry, I'm reading this question about collusion between the USGA and the PGA, and yeah, no, I think Andy brings up a good point here, because that's another thing everybody's kind of talking about is, are these players going to get banned from majors? Right? Is the USGA going to ban these players from the US Open? And of course, this year they did not. I think the RNA has came out and said that they're not going to ban players from
Correct.
the British Open
Everybody
already.
can play at the Open.
Right. And so I think that's exactly the kind of collusion, or, it's kind of circumstantial, but the kinds of things that either players or Live Golf as an entity itself would be looking for in a potential antitrust claim.
So we're looking, we've talked a lot about the economics here and the value proposition for the players that sign with Live. And we talked about it a little bit earlier, but injunctive relief is damages enough to satisfy the Sherman Act. So when you go to damages, you say, my inability to participate are my damages. I have to be allowed to participate because I qualified for this tour.
Right. I would think so. I mean, my intuition is yes, but I'm not sure. It's not the thing I had contemplated, 3 short months ago when I wrote the paper. It's funny how I was rereading it earlier just in preparation for this. And I was like, this is good, interesting stuff, but this is old. This is like, it was like, I think all it could say was like Phil Mickelson might be going. And that was the extent of the speculation at that point, was that Phil might go. And now you think, how many top 30 guys in the world have already played and are scheduled to play this coming weekend. I think it's, 4 or 5 or 6. So
Well, I can only put it to you this way: as a young lawyer studying for the bar exam to embark on a career, when I tell this to law students all the time, I talk about an interview that Tom Hanks once gave as part of the questionnaire on inside the actor's studio. And he was asked, which one job would you never want to have? And he, without missing a beat, said, a lawyer, because your whole job is doing homework. And the point is, you wrote this paper just a few months ago, and it was really good arguments about what might be. But in 3 months, there's a lot more to learn and more homework to do as these things keep changing, because as what was a maybe becomes a reality, now you have to shift your reasoning and look at it another way, which is why I raised this question about the injunctive relief, because, well, and I think it works. My damages are that I can't participate in an organization that admitted me, and they have banned me from earning a living.
yeah,
And they have colluded to do that. It would seem to me that that would satisfy that part of the 5-part test in the antitrust world. But I think it's going to be interesting moving forward, because, as you may have seen, there's a bill in the U.S. Senate now to take away baseball's antitrust protection because of what happened with minor league baseball. Any
yeah.
thoughts on that, Mr. Baseball Arbitration?
Well, I think, I mean, it's something interesting that I think kind of becomes prescient when you think about this paper and the stuff going on, in the golf world, and then the stuff going on in the college athletic space, of how different it is when there's a union in place, right? When there's collective bargaining happening, as opposed to kind of one governing body here, the PGA Tour or the NCAA or the UFC, even these non-unionized sports, and how important antitrust law has become to, broadly speaking, labor rights in this space. So I think the issue of whether the PGA Tour itself should have a union, is kind of, it came up previously in the 90s, I think, but hasn't sparked much debate in the time since. And I think it's something that maybe should be reconsidered or revisited, at least, because you lose the antitrust exemption in baseball, for example. A huge part of that is because of the narrative and how much it's changed in light of what Major League Baseball's Players Association is be able to do, all the way back to the 60s. So, and then on top of that, the rising, labor issues in minor league baseball, and the idea of minor league baseball union. And I think that might've been what they were getting at. I haven't been able to read it in depth because it was just this morning, but, the idea of kind of collective bargaining and unionizing in sports is something, that, baseball has done a pretty good job with relative to some of these other sports. And so it'd be interesting to see if there's any revival in that type of narrative in baseball in golf and in fighting and that type of thing.
So I think the lesson here is a well-written paper raising an interesting topic just a few months ago should be looked at entirely differently now that it's all come to pass and there are real issues at play. But the antitrust issue is very relevant. There's a lot of money at stake. There's a lot of other tangential issues, but we'll just talk about, as we have today, these antitrust issues. Really enjoyed your paper. I think it's a fine, winning submission. And I really thank you for taking part as a student member of the SLA. And even though you may not be in sports right away in your career, I certainly hope that you stay involved and keep your interest in the organization. And for any lawyers there in Kansas City, I see one that's on this call. You may be, Andrew's there in Kansas City studying for the bar exam. Maybe he'll reach out to you to talk to you about a career, and you can offer to buy him a cup of coffee when he reaches out. Anyway, Andrew, thank you so much. Thanks for the paper submission. Thanks for helping to drive what it is we do, I got to please do. So you got to reach out to the person I told you to reach
Awesome.
out to.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
And so thank you everybody for joining us. And don't forget, you can find out more about the Sports Lawyers Association by going to sportslaw.org. We're an annual membership, so if you haven't renewed your membership since the first of the year, please do. We have some interesting things coming up. Always check our calendar for the different events. Be back here with Sports Shorts in 2 weeks. Next May, we'll see you in LA for our annual conference. And so thank you all for watching. We'll look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. And Andrew, good luck on the bar exam.
Thank
And
you.
we'll talk to you soon. Thanks very
Yeah,
much.
sounds good. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.